The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the bustling parking lot of the local grocery store. Michelle Johnson maneuvered her cart carefully between rows of cars, her 8-year-old daughter, Jasmine, skipping happily beside her. The day had been ordinary, just another trip to stock up on essentials, but there was a quiet charm to it. Jasmine chattered animatedly about her school project, her voice light and carefree, while Michelle listened with half a smile, nodding occasionally as she checked items off her mental list. As they reached their car, Michelle opened the trunk and began loading the groceries inside. She hummed softly under her breath, the rhythmic clinking of jars and crinkling of plastic bags filling the air. Jasmine leaned against the side of the car, twirling a strand of her curly hair, completely absorbed in recounting her favorite parts of the day. Everything seemed so normal, so peaceful. But sometimes, even the most ordinary moments can take an unexpected turn. Out of the corner of her eye, Michelle noticed a police cruiser parked a few spaces away. At first, she paid it no mind. It wasn't unusual to see officers patrolling public areas like this. But then something caught her attention. The officer sitting inside appeared to be staring directly at them. His eyes were fixed on Michelle and Jasmine, unwavering and intense. A flicker of unease passed through her chest, but she tried to shake it off. Maybe he's just keeping an eye out for suspicious activity, she thought. After all, that's what cops are supposed to do, right? Still, the feeling lingered. As she continued unloading the groceries, Michelle couldn't help but glance back every now and then. Each time, the officer was still there, watching silently. It wasn't the kind of watchful gaze that made you feel safe. It carried a weight, a sense of judgment that prickled at her skin. She felt exposed, as though his stare could peel away layers of her identity and reduce her to nothing more than a stereotype. "Mommy, why is that policeman looking at us?" Jasmine asked innocently, tugging on Michelle's sleeve. Her wide brown eyes mirrored the same confusion her mother felt. Michelle hesitated before answering. How do you explain prejudice to a child who still believes the world is fair? Instead, she forced a reassuring smile and said, "Don't worry about him, baby. He's probably just doing his job." But deep down, Michelle knew better. She'd experienced enough microaggressions throughout her life to recognize when someone saw her not as a person, but as a label. Whether it was being followed around in stores or hearing snide remarks from strangers, these encounters left scars that never fully healed. And now, standing here in broad daylight with her daughter by her side, she couldn't shake the nagging fear that this moment might spiral into something worse. Despite her discomfort, Michelle kept moving, determined not to let anyone ruin their afternoon. She finished packing the last bag into the trunk and closed it with a soft thud. Taking a deep breath, she turned toward Jasmine, ready to usher her into the car and leave this unsettling scene behind. Little did she know, the worst was yet to come, and it would change everything. Just as Michelle was about to open the car door for Jasmine, she heard heavy footsteps approaching behind her. She turned around to see the officer from the cruiser walking toward them, his expression stern and his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. His presence felt overwhelming, like a storm cloud rolling in and casting a shadow over what had been a bright, ordinary day. "Man," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Why didn't you signal before pulling out of that parking space?" Michelle blinked, caught off guard by the accusation. She hadn't even pulled out yet. They were still standing next to their car. Confusion flickered across her face as she tried to make sense of his words. "I'm sorry, officer," she said calmly, keeping her tone polite despite the tension bubbling inside her. "We haven't left the parking spot yet. We're just loading our groceries." The officer's jaw tightened, and instead of acknowledging her explanation, he pressed further. "You know the rules, right? Signaling is mandatory. Or are people like you too busy breaking laws to care?" His tone dripped with condescension, and the phrase "people like you" hit Michelle like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time she'd heard those words, or ones like them, but it stung every single time. Her heart began to race, not just from fear, but from anger. She glanced down at Jasmine, who stood frozen beside her, clutching her mother's arm tightly. The little girl's eyes were wide with confusion and growing unease. "Officer," Michelle replied firmly, trying to keep her voice steady, "we haven't done anything wrong. If you have concerns, I'm happy to address them, but there's no need to speak to me this way." Instead of backing down, the officer stepped closer, invading Michelle's personal space. His towering frame loomed over her, an intimidating figure meant to assert dominance. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped. "You think you can just waltz around here without following the rules. That's why we have problems in this country." Each word felt like a calculated jab, designed to provoke and demean. Michelle clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the urge to retaliate. She knew better than to escalate the situation, especially with her daughter watching. But the injustice of it burned inside her. Why was he targeting her? Was it because of the color of her skin? Because she was a black woman standing in a parking lot with her child? Jasmine tugged on Michelle's sleeve again, her small voice trembling. "Mommy, what's happening? Why is he yelling?" Michelle knelt down briefly, placing a reassuring hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though her own nerves betrayed her calm exterior. "Everything will be fine." Standing back up, she addressed the officer once more, her patience wearing thin. "Sir, if you have an issue, please explain it clearly. Otherwise, we'd like to go about our day." But the officer wasn't interested in reason. He scoffed, shaking his head as though Michelle's very existence offended him. "Go ahead, play the victim," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. "That's all you people ever do." The comment struck a nerve, igniting a fire within Michelle. For years, she'd endured subtle slights and overt discrimination, always biting her tongue for the sake of peace. But today, with her daughter standing beside her, witnessing this blatant disrespect, something inside her shifted. She wouldn't let him reduce her to a stereotype or intimidate her into silence. Before she could respond, however, the officer's demeanor changed abruptly. His face twisted with frustration, or perhaps rage, and without warning, he raised his hand. Time seemed to slow as Michelle braced herself, unsure of what was coming next. The sudden movement sent shockwaves through the parking lot, drawing gasps from nearby witnesses. What happened next would leave an indelible mark, not just on Michelle and Jasmine, but on everyone who saw it unfold. The sound of the slap echoed through the parking lot like a crack of thunder, cutting through the afternoon calm. Michelle staggered back, her cheek stinging from the force of the blow. Her hand instinctively flew to her face, fingers trembling as they brushed against the burning skin. For a moment, she couldn't process what had just happened. Her mind struggled to reconcile the sight of a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, striking her in front of her own child. Jasmine's scream pierced the air, raw and heart-wrenching. "Mommy," she cried, tears streaming down her face as she clung to Michelle's leg. The little girl's wide eyes darted between her mother and the officer, confusion and terror etched into every feature. She didn't understand why this man, who wore a uniform and carried a badge, was hurting her mom. All she knew was that something terrible was happening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Michelle's knees buckled slightly under the weight of shock and pain, but she forced herself to stay upright. Her vision blurred for a second, not from the physical impact, but from the sheer disbelief coursing through her body. How could this be real? How could someone with authority abuse their power so recklessly, so cruelly? As the initial wave of shock began to subside, anger surged in its place, hot and unrelenting. The officer stood there, his chest heaving, his expression smug as if daring her to fight back. He seemed to revel in the fear he'd instilled, feeding off the chaos he'd created. But what he didn't anticipate was the strength that lay dormant within Michelle, a quiet resilience forged by years of enduring prejudice and injustice. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Jasmine, about teaching her daughter that she deserved respect, no matter who tried to take it away. Summoning every ounce of courage, Michelle straightened herself, ignoring the throbbing ache in her cheek. She locked eyes with the officer, refusing to look away or show weakness. "How dare you?" she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You have no right to put your hands on me. I haven't done anything wrong." Her words hung in the air, sharp and defiant, drawing murmurs from the growing crowd of onlookers. Some people gasped audibly, while others shouted at the officer to step back. A few bystanders pulled out their phones, capturing the scene in shaky video footage. One woman yelled, "That's assault. You can't hit her like that." Another man added, "We're recording this. The whole world needs to see what you just did." The officer faltered for a split second, clearly unprepared for the backlash. His confident smirk wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed aware of the gravity of his actions. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, stepping closer to Michelle again. "Don't act like you're some victim," he spat, his tone laced with venom. "You brought this on yourself." That was the final straw. Something inside Michelle snapped, not out of despair, but out of determination. Years ago, she'd taken a self-defense class after hearing stories of women being targeted in public spaces. At the time, she never imagined she'd need those skills to fend off someone wearing a badge. But now, faced with an aggressor who showed no remorse, she knew exactly what to do. With swift precision, Michelle raised her arm and pushed firmly against the officer's chest, creating distance between them. The move caught him off guard, causing him to stumble backward. Gasps rippled through the crowd once more, followed by cheers of support. Someone shouted, "Go, Michelle. Stand your ground." Another voice chimed in, "Yeah, don't let him bully you." For a moment, the tables turned completely. The officer, who moments earlier had exuded dominance and control, now looked rattled and unsure. His attempt to intimidate Michelle had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed not only to her defiance, but also to the judgment of the dozens of witnesses surrounding them. As the adrenaline coursed through her veins, Michelle felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. And as she stood tall, shielding Jasmine with her body, she realized that this moment would define not just her future, but her daughter's as well. The moment Michelle pushed the officer back, a wave of collective energy surged through the parking lot. The crowd that had gathered, initially hesitant and unsure of how to react, now erupted into action. People stepped forward, forming a protective barrier between Michelle, Jasmine, and the officer. Their voices rose in unison, demanding justice and accountability. "Leave her alone," one man shouted, his arms crossed as he stood shoulder to shoulder with others. "You can't treat people like this." Another woman added, her phone held high to record every second of the unfolding drama. The officer, now visibly shaken by the unexpected resistance, tried to regain control of the situation. He reached for his radio, muttering something about backup, but the crowd wasn't having it. They pressed closer, their presence an impenetrable wall of solidarity. Someone called 911, not to report Michelle, but to document the officer's misconduct. "We need internal affairs here," a bystander said firmly into the phone. "This cop just assaulted a woman in front of her kid." Michelle, still standing tall despite the chaos swirling around her, felt a surge of gratitude toward these strangers who had stepped up without hesitation. She didn't know their names or faces, but she could see the determination in their eyes. They weren't just defending her. They were standing against the kind of systemic injustice that had plagued communities for generations. In that moment, Michelle realized she wasn't alone. She was part of something bigger, a movement fueled by courage, compassion, and the refusal to stay silent. Jasmine, though still trembling, seemed to draw strength from the crowd's support. One woman knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, you're safe," she said softly, offering a reassuring smile. "Your mommy is so brave, and we're all here to help." Jasmine nodded slowly, her tears subsiding as she clung to the comfort of the stranger's words. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Michelle turned her attention back to the officer, who was now flustered and defensive. His earlier bravado had crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. "You think this is over?" he growled, pointing a finger at Michelle. But his threat lacked conviction. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. He was no longer the untouchable authority figure. He was a man exposed, vulnerable, and outmatched. "This is over," Michelle shot back, her voice firm and unwavering. "You crossed a line today, and I won't let you get away with it." Her words carried not just anger, but resolve. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Filing a complaint, navigating legal battles, and facing potential retaliation would test her strength in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But in that parking lot, surrounded by allies and fueled by righteous indignation, she made a silent promise to herself. She would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by those sworn to protect them. As the tension reached its peak, 2 more police cruisers arrived, their flashing lights casting red and blue hues across the scene. Officers spilled out, some rushing to restrain the aggressor, while others attempted to disperse the crowd. But the damage was done. The story of what had happened here was already spreading far beyond the confines of the parking lot. Videos uploaded to social media within minutes racked up thousands of views, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. Hashtags like #JusticeForMichelle trended online, drawing national attention to the incident. Through it all, Michelle remained composed, holding Jasmine close as the world around them shifted. She understood that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly empowered, not because she had fought back, but because she had inspired others to join her in the fight. Together, they had sent a powerful message. No one, not even those in uniform, was above the law. And when justice failed, the people would rise to demand it. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind for Michelle. What had started as an ordinary trip to the grocery store had spiraled into a national conversation about police accountability and systemic racism. Social media buzzed with posts, videos, and hashtags supporting her cause. People from all walks of life, strangers she'd never met, shared messages of solidarity, praising her courage while condemning the officer's actions. The overwhelming support gave Michelle a sense of hope, but it also came with its own challenges. Every morning, Michelle woke up to notifications flooding her phone. News articles dissecting the altercation, comments debating whether justice would be served, and even death threats from those who sided with the officer. It was exhausting, navigating this newfound spotlight while trying to shield Jasmine from the darker aspects of public scrutiny. Despite the chaos, Michelle refused to back down. She knew the importance of staying visible, not just for herself, but for others who might find strength in her story. With the help of civil rights organizations that reached out to her, Michelle began assembling a team of lawyers determined to hold the officer accountable. They explained the legal process step by step, preparing her for what lay ahead. Filing a formal complaint against law enforcement wasn't easy. It required evidence, witnesses, and relentless persistence. But Michelle was ready. She gathered every piece of documentation she could: photos of her bruised cheek, screenshots of threatening messages, and copies of the viral videos taken by bystanders. Each item added weight to her case, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Meanwhile, the community rallied around her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Local activists organized rallies outside the police precinct where the offending officer worked. Protest signs read, "Protect and serve, not harm," and "Accountability starts now." Families brought their children to march alongside them, showing young ones the power of standing up for what's right. Michelle attended one of these protests, holding Jasmine's hand tightly as they walked among the sea of supporters. For the first time, she didn't feel isolated in her struggle. She felt part of a movement greater than herself. At home, however, the emotional toll became harder to ignore. Jasmine had nightmares about the incident, waking up in tears and asking if the mean man would come back. Michelle held her close each night, whispering words of reassurance until sleep finally claimed her again. To help both of them cope, Michelle enrolled in therapy sessions specifically designed for families dealing with trauma. Talking through her feelings allowed her to unpack the anger, fear, and sadness she'd been carrying since that day in the parking lot. Slowly but surely, she and Jasmine began to heal. As weeks turned into months, the case gained significant traction. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing witnesses and experts on police brutality. Civil rights leaders spoke passionately about the need for reform, using Michelle's experience as a catalyst for change. Even celebrities joined the conversation, amplifying her voice and urging their followers to demand justice. The pressure mounted on local authorities to take action, forcing the police department to issue a statement acknowledging the investigation into the officer's conduct. For Michelle, this period was bittersweet. On one hand, she marveled at how far her story had traveled, sparking important conversations across the country. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the frustration of knowing that many similar cases never received this level of attention or support. Still, she remained focused on the goal, ensuring that the officer faced consequences for his actions and that policies were implemented to prevent such incidents in the future. One evening, as Michelle tucked Jasmine into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy," she asked softly, "are we going to win?" Michelle paused, brushing a strand of hair from Jasmine's face. Winning wasn't guaranteed, but giving up wasn't an option either. "We're already winning, baby," she replied with a gentle smile, "because we stood up when it mattered most. And sometimes, that's enough to make the world listen." The legal battle proved to be as grueling as Michelle had anticipated. The police department initially tried to downplay the incident, releasing a vague statement claiming the officer had acted in self-defense. To anyone who hadn't seen the videos or heard witness accounts, it might have sounded plausible. But Michelle and her team were prepared. They methodically dismantled the narrative, presenting irrefutable evidence that painted a very different picture. During depositions, Michelle recounted every detail of that fateful day. The officer's hostile demeanor, his racially charged comments, and the unprovoked slap that left her reeling. Her voice trembled at times, but she remained steadfast, refusing to let intimidation silence her. Witnesses who had been present in the parking lot also testified, their accounts aligning perfectly with hers. One bystander described how the officer seemed intent on escalating the situation, while another recalled shouting at him to step back after witnessing the assault. Each testimony added another layer of credibility to Michelle's case. But the fight wasn't without its hurdles. The officer's defense team worked tirelessly to discredit Michelle, questioning her character and motives. They suggested she had provoked the confrontation, insinuating that her reaction, pushing him away, was excessive. It was a classic tactic: shift the blame onto the victim and paint them as the aggressor. For Michelle, these accusations felt like yet another form of attack, but she refused to let them break her spirit. With her lawyers by her side, she countered each claim calmly and confidently, pointing out the absurdity of blaming someone for defending themselves against blatant misconduct. As public pressure mounted, protests continued outside the precinct. Supporters held signs bearing Michelle's name, chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace," and "Hold cops accountable." Local businesses even joined in, displaying posters in their windows to show solidarity. The movement gained so much momentum that city officials couldn't ignore it any longer. Public forums were organized, where residents demanded answers and called for sweeping reforms within the police department. Michelle attended one such forum, speaking passionately about her experience and urging leaders to implement measures that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Behind closed doors, internal investigations into the officer's conduct dragged on for months. Leaks from inside the department hinted at divisions among higher-ups, Some wanted to protect the officer, while others recognized the need to address public outrage. Eventually, the mounting evidence became impossible to ignore. Bodycam footage from nearby officers corroborated Michelle's account, showing the officer stepping aggressively toward her and striking her without provocation. Witness statements and video recordings further sealed his fate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the decision came. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending disciplinary action. While this was only a partial victory, Michelle had hoped for immediate termination. It marked a significant turning point. For once, accountability seemed within reach. News of the suspension spread quickly, drawing mixed reactions. Some celebrated the progress, while others argued it wasn't enough. Michelle understood both perspectives but chose to focus on the bigger picture. Every small win brought society one step closer to meaningful change. Through it all, Michelle leaned heavily on her support system. Friends, family, and even strangers sent messages of encouragement, reminding her why she couldn't give up. Therapy sessions helped her process the lingering trauma, while bonding moments with Jasmine, like baking cookies or watching movies together, provided much-needed respite from the stress. Despite the challenges, Michelle found strength in knowing she wasn't alone. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice. One evening, as Michelle scrolled through social media, she stumbled upon a post from a young woman inspired by her story. Because of Michelle. The caption read, "I'm learning to stand up for myself too." Tears welled up in Michelle's eyes as she realized the ripple effect of her courage. Whether or not the officer faced full consequences, her actions had already sparked something powerful. A chain reaction of empowerment and resilience. And in that moment, she knew the fight was worth it. The months that followed the officer's suspension were transformative, not just for Michelle and Jasmine, but for their entire community. While the legal process continued to unfold, Michelle channeled her energy into healing and advocacy. She knew the scars from that day in the parking lot would take time to fade, but she was determined not to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she focused on turning pain into purpose. Therapy became a cornerstone of their recovery. For Michelle, it was a safe space to unpack the layers of trauma, the fear, anger, and helplessness she'd felt during the altercation. Her therapist encouraged her to reframe the experience, emphasizing how her resilience had inspired countless others. "You didn't just survive," her therapist said one afternoon. "You showed people what it means to stand up, even when the odds feel insurmountable." Those words resonated deeply with Michelle, reinforcing her belief that strength wasn't about never feeling afraid. It was about moving forward despite the fear. Jasmine, too, began opening up more in therapy sessions tailored for children. At first, she struggled to articulate her emotions, often retreating into silence or sketching pictures of the incident instead of talking about it. But over time, with the guidance of a compassionate counselor, she started sharing her thoughts. One day, she drew a picture of herself standing beside her mother, both of them holding hands and smiling. In big, bold letters across the top, she wrote, "We're brave." It was a moment of triumph for Michelle, who realized her daughter wasn't just healing. She was growing stronger because of what they'd endured together. Beyond personal healing, Michelle threw herself into activism, becoming a voice for change in her community. She attended town hall meetings, spoke at rallies, and collaborated with civil rights organizations to push for police reform. Her story resonated with audiences far and wide, inspiring them to demand accountability and transparency from law enforcement. People admired not only her courage, but also her grace under pressure. She never portrayed herself as a victim. Instead, she framed her journey as one of empowerment, a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. One particularly impactful event was a panel discussion hosted by a local university. Michelle sat alongside other activists, academics, and survivors of police brutality, sharing insights and strategies for systemic change. When it was her turn to speak, the room fell silent. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she began, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. It happens every day to people who look like me, who come from communities like mine. The difference is, this time, the world was watching. And now, we have an opportunity to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Her words earned a standing ovation, solidifying her role as a leader in the movement for justice. Young people approached her afterward, thanking her for giving them hope. Parents told her how they used her story to teach their kids about resilience and fairness. Even seasoned activists praised her ability to connect with diverse audiences, bridging gaps between generations and backgrounds. At home, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, or as close to normal as possible. Michelle enrolled Jasmine in art classes, where she thrived, using colors and shapes to express herself in ways words couldn't capture. Together, they planted a small garden in their backyard, nurturing flowers and vegetables as a symbol of growth and renewal. These simple joys reminded them that life wasn't defined solely by hardship. It was also about finding beauty and meaning in the aftermath. Still, Michelle remained acutely aware that the fight wasn't over. The officer's trial loomed ahead, promising another round of emotional challenges. But she faced it with renewed determination, knowing she had already achieved something remarkable. By refusing to stay silent, she had ignited a spark, a beacon of hope for those yearning for justice. As she tucked Jasmine into bed one night, she whispered softly, "No matter what happens next, remember this. We stood tall when it mattered most, and that will always be our victory." The day of the trial arrived, bringing with it a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The courtroom was packed. Supporters of Michelle filled the benches, holding signs discreetly tucked away, while journalists scribbled notes in anticipation of the verdict. Cameras lined the hallways outside, capturing every step Michelle took as she entered the building, her head held high and Jasmine's hand firmly in hers. This wasn't just another court case. It was a moment that could set a precedent for accountability within law enforcement. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The officer sat stoically at the defendant's table, his expression unreadable but noticeably less confident than before. His defense team argued vigorously, attempting to paint him as a misunderstood public servant who had acted under duress. But the prosecution countered with overwhelming evidence: video footage showing the unprovoked slap, witness testimonies recounting his aggressive behavior, and even internal reports highlighting past complaints against him. Each piece of evidence chipped away at his credibility, leaving little room for doubt about his misconduct. Michelle took the stand once again, this time speaking directly to the jury. Her voice carried both strength and vulnerability as she recounted not only the events of that day, but also their lasting impact on her family. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, looking each juror in the eye. "All I wanted was to finish my errands and go home to my daughter. Instead, I was attacked in front of her, not by a stranger, but by someone who swore an oath to protect us." She paused, glancing briefly at Jasmine seated in the audience, before continuing. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel powerless because of the color of their skin or the uniform someone else wears." Her words struck a chord, resonating deeply with everyone present. Even some of the jurors nodded subtly, visibly moved by her testimony. By the time closing arguments concluded, there was a palpable sense that justice might finally prevail. Days later, the verdict came down: guilty on charges of assault and misconduct. Gasps erupted in the courtroom, followed by applause from Michelle's supporters. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her lawyers, overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd achieved together. The judge sentenced the officer to prison time, stripped him of his badge, and ordered mandatory counseling, a rare outcome in cases involving police brutality. For many in attendance, it felt like a monumental victory, one that validated the courage of victims everywhere. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted as news spread through the crowd. Supporters chanted Michelle's name, hoisting signs high above their heads. Reporters clamored for statements, but Michelle kept her response simple yet powerful. "Today isn't just about me," she told them, cradling Jasmine close. "It's about proving that no one is above the law." not even those sworn to uphold it. We still have work to do, but this gives me hope that change is possible. In the weeks that followed, Michelle continued advocating for reform, using her platform to push for policy changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Body cameras became mandatory in her city, and training programs were revamped to emphasize de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Activists hailed her case as a turning point, proof that sustained pressure could yield results. For Michelle and Jasmine, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Though the scars remained, they no longer defined them. Together, they found solace in small victories, watching their garden bloom, celebrating milestones, and cherishing quiet moments free from fear. Michelle often reminded Jasmine of the importance of standing up for what's right, instilling in her the same resilience that had carried them through their darkest days. As Michelle stood on stage at a community event months later, addressing a crowd eager to hear her story, she reflected on how far they'd come. "We didn't choose this fight," she said, smiling warmly at Jasmine sitting in the front row. "But we faced it head-on, and we're stronger because of it. Justice doesn't happen overnight. It takes all of us working together. So let's keep going, one step at a time." Her words echoed through the auditorium, met with thunderous applause. Michelle knew the journey ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew something more important. She had inspired others to believe in the power of perseverance. And sometimes, that was the greatest victory of all.